Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Over the last couple of weeks and months, we've been extremely vocal that this Florida Gators program heading into 2024 is one of the more intriguing teams that you see across the college football landscape. And although a lot of national media talking heads like to write this team off, there are a lot of reasons to believe this Florida team takes a massive step in the right direction heading into the 2024 year. Want to dive into this Florida Gators program, but more importantly, take a look back at 2023 and look at why this team might be vastly improved heading into 2024. Now, I want to make it very clear that I'm not necessarily getting up here and saying that this Florida Gators program is going to go win an SEC championship, make a run in the college football playoffs. But I do want to point out some things that Florida Gator fans should be really optimistic with heading into 2024, fired up to get into this one. Before we do, and as always, just want to say thank you to you guys. It's been a blast taking a deep dive into this program over the last couple of weeks and months. The support you guys have shown truly means a lot. If you guys do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into this one. And I want to start with, something that doesn't get enough talked about, and that is the quarterback play for this Florida Gators program. How many quarterbacks in the SEC are we taking over Graham Mertz heading into 2024? And I think the short answer is not that many. You go back and look at Graham Mertz and what he did in the 2023 season, a 72% completion percentage. That was top 5 in the country, threw for just under 3,000 yards, 20 touchdowns to 3 interceptions. There's a lot of reason to believe that Graham Mertz even takes another step for this Florida program heading into 2024, year 2 under this system. But I think more importantly than the quarterback play, there are some other aspects of this team that I think take a massive step in the right direction heading into 2024. And that starts with an improved offensive line. Now, I've been very critical that I don't think this Florida team took enough opportunities and shots down the field in their passing attack, right? We talked about Graham Mertz, 72% completion percentage, almost 3,000 yards. You look at that Florida offense from 2023, they largely didn't ask Graham Mertz to push the ball down the field all that often. You take a look at the average depth of target, it wasn't very high. You think of a large reason why Florida might not have been pushing the ball down the field is they couldn't really pass protect up front. And you looked at this Florida Gator offensive line in 2023, it gave up a sack on 9.3% of its dropbacks. That was 115th in the country. And the more and more I go back and watch that Florida team in 2023, it had to do with Damian George at that right tackle spot. And I don't mean to drag Damian George, but I thought the rest of that Florida Gators offensive line was not nearly as bad as I think a lot of people like to note. But Damian George at that right tackle spot, over 25 pressures given up, gave up multiple sacks in key moments for this Florida Gators program. I think the mere fact that you kick Damian George into guard, I think that's going to make this offensive line better. But I think even more importantly, they looked at the tackle spot and said that was the weakest part of this Florida Gators roster. They went out and addressed it in the transfer portal, right? You take a look at Austin Barber, been really solid. You kick Damian George into guard. You bring in Brandon Crenshaw-Dixon. This is, in my mind, a bona fide starter at right tackle for Florida in 2024, a massive upgrade from what you had with Damian George. You also bring in a very intriguing offensive tackle in Devin Manuel, who I think certainly can compete for starting reps for this Florida Gators offensive line, a guy that at times played quite good for Arkansas in 2023. You rewind 12 months ago and say, Florida had maybe one true offensive tackle that was healthy heading into 2023. You look at this Florida Gators program heading into 2024, and I think you'll look at Brendan Crenshaw-Dixon, Devin Manuel, and Austin Barber and say, I think we got 3 tackles that we feel pretty good about. So not only the talent takes a step in the right direction, I think the depth on the offensive line, specifically at that offensive tackle, it takes another step as well. And if you give Graham Mertz some better protection up front, a little bit more of a dependable run game, I think there's a lot of reason that you think Graham Mertz can take another step heading into 2024. And I think the last thing I want to talk about on the offensive side of the football is, this Florida Gators wide receiver room, I think is really intriguing. And yes, you lose a guy like Ricky Pearsall, who we've talked extensively about, was mean, phenomenal for Florida. You return a guy like Eugene Wilson, you get some much needed experience into this wide receiver, right? Starting off with a guy like Tremere Dike, who can be that vertical threat for this Florida Gators offense, a guy that when his quarterback was Graham Mertz up at Wisconsin, averaged over 16 yards per reception. Then you bring in a guy like Elijah Badger, who we just did a film study on, a elite wide receiver, operating after the catch, can work those short intermediate route trees. I look at Eugene Wilson, Elijah Badger, and Tremere Dike and say, although Florida just lost a first-round NFL draft pick, I think there is reason to believe that this wide receiver room might have taken a step in the right direction heading into 2024. And then you sprinkle in guys like Ada Mazzell or a guy like Andy Jean, guys that we were really excited about 12 months ago as true freshmen. They get another year under their belt. They get that physical maturation. I mean, those are some contributors as well for this Florida wide receiver room. I'm excited about Graham Mertz having better protection, having a more diverse skill set of pass catchers. And then you go over to the defensive side of the football and you kind of say, one, you make no mistake, this defense had some serious growing pains in the 2023 season. I don't think anybody's going to argue that any differently. But I think one reason to be excited about this defense is, one, you didn't really lose any NFL draft talent, right? Princely he transfers to Ole Miss. That is no doubt a loss in terms of a pure pass rusher. But I think if you're Florida, there's a couple of reasons to be excited. One, year two of the Austin Armstrong defense. That was a very young defensive coordinator that was given an SEC job with a very young Florida Gators defense. Multiple guys getting a lot of reps as true freshmen. You look at guys like Jordan Castell or Kelby Collins or Bryce Stewart, and you say, all right, there's reason to believe that Austin Armstrong getting another offseason with so much young talent, they're going to take a step in the right direction. And you see this happen, I mean, really all over college football. Year two defensive coordinators normally seem to have better years once they get a second year in that system, coaching up what they want to do. And you make no mistake, Austin Armstrong puts a lot of, I guess, schemes on this Florida Gators defense played. And I think at times they were just a little bit young. You saw some busts in coverage. And I think Billy Napier made some really good hires in terms of the position coaches as well. And you look at the front seven, say Kelby Collins, TJ Searcy, you get Justin Boone back from injury. You kind of expect all of those guys to take some steps in the right direction. You inject a guy in LJ McCray, who we are certainly believers on. You look at the linebacker spot and say Shamar James and Grayson Howard, Pup Howard. I don't know how many more linebacker rooms are just as purely talented as what you have there. And then you have Coach Roberts coming in, who is one of the better linebacker coaches in the country. Then you go to the back end and say, this was a young Florida Gators team last year on the defensive side of the football, specifically in the back end, right? Guys like Devin Moore, true sophomore, guys like Bryce Thornton and Jordan Castell, they were true freshmen playing a ton of football for the Florida Gators. You had a young secondary that you inject some really, really good veteran talent. And I thought this was a genius move by Billy Napier and the coaching staff to go get guys that have been around the block a time or two, right? Asa Turner, DJ Douglas, Triquez Bridges, all guys that can do some different things, can play in the box, can play that free safety role. But at the end of the day, you're injecting veteran presences into a relatively young Florida Gators defensive back room. I think there's a lot of reason to believe that secondary takes a step in the right direction. And then lastly, I mean, something that needs to be cleaned up. And I've been pretty vocal about being a Billy Napier defender. I've taken some heat in the comments section for it, and at times certainly justified. If this doesn't get cleaned up, now we start entertaining the thoughts about Billy Napier and his future in Gainesville, and that's the turnovers and penalties, right? This was a team that won 5 games in the SEC. It was 96th in the country in turnover margin. It was 118th in terms of penalty yards per game. That is just not winning football. And I get it was a very young team. It was year 2 under Billy Napier. There are some reasons to kind of understand why you had some of those penalties and turnovers. In 2024, that stuff needs to get cleaned up. And I think if it does get cleaned up, you're talking about a 5-win season. That's probably a 7-win season if you are just remotely average in some of those departments. And if you can take that step in turnovers, penalties, some of those hidden plays that end up costing you games, I think that can lead to a few more wins for this Florida program. And you look at the schedule, and yeah, there's no way around it. The Florida fans know, we all know it. This schedule is an absolute bear. but the beginning of the schedule, the first 5 games are going to be monster for this Florida Gators program. One, because I think this young roster, this young coaching staff, they need to kind of understand what it feels like to win some of those games, right? You go back to the last 2 years when it was the biggest moments, it just didn't seem like Florida was kind of used to and expecting to win some of those games. And I think the first 5 games of the season are quite gettable, right? You look at getting Miami at home. I'm not necessarily going to pick Florida in that game yet. We're going to break down that game from a couple of different angles, but you get them at home. It's, excuse me, it's going to be an absolutely rowdy environment. You get Samford at home. You get Texas A&M at home, a Texas A&M team that I am quite high on, but has a ton of new faces that's coming in the transfer portal. You go on the road to Mississippi State, and then you get UCF at home. If this team can be 3-2, potentially even 4-1, if you can pick up that Texas A&M game at home, I think this team just needs a little bit of confidence. And then you look towards the back half of the schedule, and if you get a confident Florida Gators team, you saw them beat Tennessee last year at home. I think they certainly can beat Kentucky at home this year. They just kind of laid an egg last year. And then Georgia, Texas, LSU, Ole Miss, Florida State. There is no secret about it. That is an absolute ringer of a schedule. But I think for Florida Gator fans, what you're most excited about is what happens if this team going into November, where you go on that ruthless stretch, is believing in themselves and thinks they can win some of these games. Maybe you can win a few of those games. And I'm not necessarily picking Florida, and quite frankly, right now, any of those games. But if this Florida team that certainly has the talent, I don't think anybody's arguing that, can start believing in their ability to win some of those games. I look at that schedule and say, if you can start at 3-2, 4-1, pick up one of those games against Tennessee or Kentucky and kind of go into that back half of the season with 5 wins under your belt, I think there's a lot of reason to be really optimistic about what this Florida team can do. And again, am I picking them to win the SEC? Am I picking them to make the college football playoffs? No. But I think if you can kind of stack some wins in 2024, and then you look to the talent that this team is going to have in 2025, I think that's the recipe for Billy Napier to really kick this program into high gear. This team is sneaky. And I think a lot of people are writing them off, and it's understandable from what you saw last year. This team returns a lot of young talent. I think they made some really good additions, not only in the portal, but to their coaching staff. We'll see how this team kind of plays out in 2024. We're going to talk a lot about this program over the next couple of months. Appreciate you guys rocking with the fellas. Hope you guys have a phenomenal Memorial Day weekend, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.